Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, Jonathan. The pleasure is mine to be here. And I'd like to thank the Center for inviting me and organizing this talk. Can theologians and economists talk to each other? And if they do, does their dialogue hold any promises of good fruit? That's the question I want you to think about together with me during this talk. The fact of the matter is that, at least in the part of the world where I live, such dialogue does not happen very often. Theologians truly talk about economics, but rarely to economists. And among economists, there is a field now called the economics of religion, but it doesn't really deal with theological issues. Rather, it's kind of an industrial organization study of churches. So there's not much dialogue, and I think that's wrong. Dialogue between economists and theologians actually have a long and fruitful tradition, which has largely been forgotten today, and in my remarks I will give you a quick overview and tour through this tradition and then talk about the main difficulties and explain where the promises lie today as far as I can see it. Now, when you say economics and theology, most people immediately think about Max Weber, who wrote a famous and important study on the Protestantic ethic and the spirit of capitalism. And Weber wrote this book during his years at the University of Heidelberg, which at the time was a citadel of the so-called German Historical School of Economics. One of the principal leaders of that school was a man called Karl Knies, Weber's academic teacher and predecessor on a chair of economics and public finance at Heidelberg. Knies was able to attract a number of talented American students, and this is actually interesting. During that time, second half of the 19th century, American economists used to flock to Germany. Today, German economists flock to the United States. Anyway, one of those students was John Bates Clark, in whose memory the American Economic Association annually awards a highly prestigious Medal for Economic Promise. Clark received his PhD from Heidelberg in 1875. He was later president of the American Economic Association. And another of Knies's students, Richard T. Ely, also received his PhD from Heidelberg in 1879 and was the American Economic Association's first secretary. Now, I mention these two gentlemen because both of them had studied theology, anticipating to become ministers before they turned to economics. Clark, in his book called The Philosophy of Wealth, defines wealth as including everything that contributes to human flourishing, such as arts, education, and religion. Today we would say society's cultural and spiritual capital. In her material manifestations and in her spiritual service, Clark said the church constitutes a form of wealth and therefore is both a constituent part of the economy and a true object of economic analysis. Eli's two important books, Social Aspects of Christianity and An Introduction to Political Economy, combined economic analysis with theological reasoning to argue for the improvement of general economic conditions. The American Economic Association, in the founding of which both were very influential, was formed with the explicit aim of bringing economics to the service of Christianity. 23 of 181 original members of the association were Protestant ministers, many of them active in what was called the social gospel movement. So for Eli and many other economists at the time, Christian theology provided the moral foundation for economics, and the role of economics was to inform the church about how the economy worked and to help the church to achieve her social mission. So these two outstanding scholars, Eli and Clark, illustrate a fact that has largely been forgotten today. At the time of Knies and Weber, it was very customary to have an active exchange of ideas between the venerable discipline of theology and the still fledgling discipline of economics. And this was no coincidence. As an academic discipline, economics is actually a late child of theology. Adam Smith, who is generally considered the founder of modern economics, held a chair of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow, and in that function he would have lectured, among other things, on theology, natural theology, that is. Many of his contemporaries had their intellectual roots in theology, and many actively served the church. Thomas Malthus, the first economist studying the dynamics of economic development of population in the late 18th century, Malthus was a minister of the Anglican Church before he received the first chair of political economy in England. Malthus' dynamic theory was built on the juxtaposition of two dynamic forces, linear growth in food production and exponential growth in population. And without going into mathematics, you can imagine that when one curve grows like this and another curve grows like this, there's a point in time when you're in trouble. So adding Malthus' claim that malnutrition would lead to population decline, whereas nutrition in excess of the bare minimum would reduce death rates and increase birth rates, you get the result that lasting improvement of society, increasing general standards of living, that is, was impossible. Now, Malthus and William Paley, who was ordained as a priest in 1767 and later served as rector and archdeacon of the Anglican Church, those two together founded what Anthony Waterman calls Christian political economy of the early 19th century. Thomas Chalmers, a student of Malthus, who had studied theology at St. Andrews University, and after a period of serving as a Protestant minister, taught moral philosophy at St. Andrews. Chalmers published his book called Political Economy in connection with the moral state and the moral prospects of society in 1808. In the introduction to his book, Chalmers writes, "Political economy, though not deemed an essential branch of education for churchmen, touches very closely, notwithstanding, on certain questions in which both the interest and the duty of churchmen are concerned. The questions of pauperism and of religious establishment, though no others could be specified, would in themselves justify a reference to the lessons and principles of that science, political economy that is, even in a theological course." I have argued the same in Germany for a while, with the suggestion to Christian seminaries that they should introduce courses on political economy or economics, but with no success so far. Like Malthus, Chalmers was very interested in the interaction between food production on the one hand and population growth on the other hand. Building on a passage in William Paley's Natural Theology, Chalmers' intention was to liberate Malthus' population principle of its gloomy implications that mankind was forever destined to live in a steady state of minimum living standards. Chalmers, on the one hand, recognized the power of capital accumulation and technological progress to improve living conditions, but only temporarily. More importantly, in his view, he expected that the working population would develop a taste for better living standards, and that this, together with Christian education and values, would reduce the power of the natural desire for procreation and put a permanent check on birth rates and therefore population growth. In terms of modern economics, and there's a literature on this today, couples would have fewer children, but children of higher quality, meaning higher education and better developed habits. So parents would invest more time in raising fewer children and more resources in their education. Lasting economic improvement, Chalmers thought, would only come as a result of character improvement, and character improvement only as a result of Christian education. So in Chalmers' view, there was a positive outlook for humanity in terms of economic development, but only together with Christian education and the adoption of Christian virtues. Richard Whately studied theology, became vicar of Halesworth in 1822, and was elected the first professor of political economy at Oxford University in 1829. In a letter from that period, Whately wrote, "Religious truth appears to me intimately connected, at this time especially, with political economy. For it seems to me that before long, political economy of some sort or other must govern the world." Which is actually an interesting quote because it's reminiscent of something John Maynard Keynes once said when he said, "Without knowing it, most people in the world are governed by the thoughts of some defunct economist." Whately therefore saw it as important and necessary that the new science of political economy was not left to anti-Christians, and he intended to develop it into a sort of natural theology following Paley's example. However, he became Archbishop of Dublin soon afterwards, which put an end to his career as a political economist. In the United States, the Reverend John McVicar taught moral theology before he became Columbia University's first professor of political economy. So we see that from the beginning of political economy, thoughts, concepts, and arguments of theology and political economy were interlinked and cross-pollinated. In the United States, this development reached its first height during the first half of the 19th century in what was known the gospel of wealth, not to be confused with what now we call the prosperity gospel. Proponents of the gospel of wealth included Henry Ward Beecher, who served as a minister of New York's Plymouth Congregational Church and was for some time America's best paid clergyman, and the Baptist minister Russell Conwell, founder of Gordon Conwell Seminary. They taught that accumulating wealth benefited both individuals and society and fostered social progress, and therefore it was a Christian moral obligation. A second height of this movement was the emergence of the so-called social gospel movement after the American Civil War. Theologians and economists worked together to alleviate the social failures of capitalism, which began to emerge after the Civil War in the United States, but also work together to safeguard the functioning of competitive markets through government regulations like antitrust law. In Europe, the Dutch theologian, economist, and politician Abraham Kuyper stood for a strong interaction between theology and political economy. Kuyper regarded the capitalist economy as one of multiple spheres of society created by divine ordinance, ruled by their own respective logics and laws, but which did not exist for their own purposes. Each sphere, including the economy, was to serve the general welfare of society, the definition of which and the determination of its specific objectives is the task of Christian ethics. In Kuyper's view, there's room for an independent economic science to study the functioning of the economic sphere, but economic goals which are legitimate within that sphere, such as profit maximization or money making, must never be turned into absolute goals of economic, let alone of social life. The performance of economic institutions like firms or banks is to be judged on the basis of their contribution to the general well-being of society as a whole. The British moral philosopher Alexander Lindsay, who lived from 1879 to 1952, pursued a similar approach. In his 1930s Scott Holland lectures, published as a book under the title Christianity and Economics, Lindsay argues that the capitalist economy operates under its own specific logic and its own specific laws, which deserve serious consideration. This, he said, is a basic condition for the freedom of society. Questions regarding economic relations ought to be understood as technical ones, to be answered by the specific methods of economics. Economic actors, like businessmen, ought to be granted the freedom to act according to the laws and rules of economic relationships. Otherwise, Lindsay argued, they would not be able to fulfill their role to fulfill their serving the economic objectives of society as a whole. It is those objectives and the relevant outcomes, Lindsay argued, which must be judged on moral grounds: the general standard of living, the distribution of income and wealth, the eradication of poverty, and the preservation of the environment, and many more. And this is where Christian ethics come in, and theologians are assigned that task. It is, to quote Lindsay, our concern as Christians to understand and cure the more obvious moral dangers of the existing capitalist economic system. Understand and cure is the key word. Theologians must understand where the realm of technical economic questions begins and where it ends. And economists must understand the theological principles underlying the moral judgment of the outcomes. Dialogue between economists and theologians is necessary to promote mutual understanding. In contrast, Lindsay sharply criticized the church that has capitulated to the pressures of the economic system and resigned herself to running charitable organizations, alleviating the social evils of capitalism. This, he said, is a spiritually dangerous trade, one that fails to address the underlying problems and ends up in ineffective, self-serving charity games of the kind that Charles Dickens perfectly ridiculed by Mrs. Jellybelly, Mrs. Portugal, and Mr. Quayle in Bleak House. The book absolutely recommended. In 1938, leading members of the Freiburg School of Economics and several eminent Protestant theologians in Germany formed the so-called Freiburg Circle. They met to consider various perspectives on Germany's economic and political constitution after the end of the Nazi period. Upon an initiative by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, they wrote a manifesto on Germany's new constitutional framework for a post-war World Council of Churches. This manifesto lays the ground for West Germany's version of capitalism, the so-called social market economy, after 1948. And it was built on two pillars. Number one, guidelines and regulations of the economic order which follow from the Word of God and can and must be represented by the Church. And number two, on principles that follow from the specific logic of economic activity and have lasting relevance for its constitution. Now you might ask, where do economists and theologians find common ground? Where does the link between the two come from? And the answer is first in the common understanding of economics as a moral science. A science whose aim it is to promote justice and human welfare. And this, I'd like to point out, is very unique about economics at the time. If you would ask a physicist what is the goal of physics, he would just stare at you with blank eyes and say, there's no goal to physics other than to find out truth. But in all the early writings, there is an explicit goal to economics, and it is to improve the general welfare of the population and to provide the government with sufficient funds to do its tasks properly. According to Adam Smith, human behavior is motivated by economic self-interest, but also by self-love, which is the desire to be well regarded by other members of society, by the wish to be approved by the imaginary impartial spectator who judged behavior by the standards of man's innate moral sentiments, which is really a metaphor for Christian conscience. The new science of political economy searched for laws of wealth or laws of production, conceived as, quote, moral laws of human nature on which the economic condition of nations depend, relating to the voluntary actions of men, or in different words, are expressive of the operation of certain motives of the human mind. Such laws were regarded as constituting a divine order of social life, much in the same way as astronomers of the time regarded the laws of planetary movements as expressions of the Creator's will. The principal challenge facing the new discipline was to explain how individual self-interest could be in harmony with the interest and the welfare of society at large. Smith's ingenious answer to that question, an answer which economists have followed ever since, is in the combination of markets and competition. Markets allow individuals to pursue their self-interest in mostly anonymous relations of voluntary economic exchange, while competition forces them to serve the interest of others in order to be successful. Competitive markets thus achieve what neither law nor virtues could do alone. The second link was the scientific version of natural theology, first proposed by Francis Bacon, the notion that one can, by observing nature and later society, understand the works of God, a version of natural theology which was particularly strong in England during the 17th to the first half of the 19th century. Now, one very important concept in natural theology of that kind is the concept of divine providence. Divine providence being, to quote Professor Oslington, God's care for the creation, and it involves both the preservation of creation and God's governance of creation. Thomas Chalmers described divine providence as a striking testimony to the superior intelligence of Him who is the author of both human nature and human society, an impressive demonstration of how much the wisdom of man is outpeered by the wisdom of God. That competitive markets achieved a harmony between selfish interest, individual self-interest, and the interest of society was, in Smith's view, and the view of many of his contemporaries, the result of divine providence, for which the famous invisible hand, guiding individuals to align their self-interest with the interest of society, serves as a metaphor. So from today on, you know that if anybody ever talks about the individual, the invisible hand of the market, it's a misquote. Smith never says invisible hand of the market. He talks about the invisible hand, and that's a metaphor for providence. The French Jansenist Pierre de Bois-Guilbert, who first introduced the concept of equilibrium of market demand and supply, which still today is the cornerstone of the analysis of markets, Bois-Guilbert regarded market equilibrium as a result of God's providential care. In a similar vein, Chalmers argued that a benign population equilibrium with reasonably high incomes supported by Christian education and pastoral care was a result of divine providence. Now, dialogue and cooperation between theologians and economists of this kind requires that the two regard each other as dealing with different spheres of society, which are independent of each other, to some degree at least, but each being legitimate fields. Towards the end of the 19th century, that mutual respect and regard for one another began to crumble and eventually to disappear. Theology and economics began to distance themselves from each other. Several developments seem to have contributed to their separation. One is the demise of natural theology in England in the second half of the 19th century. A second one is the general trend of secularization in Western culture. The fact that abandoning Christian doctrine and building science on foundations not referring to Christian foundations, the fact that that became intellectual plausible and generally acceptable. And the third one, which brings us back to Max Weber, is his postulate that the social sciences should be positive sciences and free from moral judgments. Mainstream economics began to focus on how to reach a given set of objectives with scarce resources optimally without questioning the moral value of either these objectives nor of the methods employed. This went along with the increasing use of mathematical methods in economics, which made economic arguments hard to grasp for theologians. The separation between the two disciplines certainly did not remain uncontested. The 1925 World Congress of Churches rejected the idea of Christian faith and the economy being separate spheres. In his important book, entitled Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, Richard Tawney recalled the wonderful times before the Reformation, when the economy was subordinated to the moral authority of the Christian church. Economic life was ordered by Christian principles. It followed rules derived from Christian teaching, and it served to accomplish the broader goals of the Christian life. It was only after the Reformation, Tawney pointed out, and after the rise of economic and spiritual individualism, that thinking about laws of wealth or laws of production became conceivable. The result was, in Tawney's view, that religion and theology lost their authority over economic affairs. Tawney admits that economic principles such as efficiency are necessary for a functioning economy. But such principles must never become ends in themselves. If they were allowed to do so, Tawney warned, the world would be ruled by an idolatry of wealth, which would be the negation, quote again, negation of any system of thought or morals which can, except by metaphor, be described as Christian. However, Tawney did not make it clear where that statement should lead, except possibly the hope for a turning back of the clock and the resuming of the church's authority over economic life. Now, Weber's postulate notwithstanding, economists never fully accepted the idea of a value-free social science. The best professional journals today require authors to draw out the welfare implications of whatever they have analyzed. And this, of course, is impossible without defining what welfare is. But the underlying moral tenets generally remain obscure. In the past 25 years, the emergence of what we call behavioral economics, which studies human decision-making and behavior, has generated a strong interest in questions of morals in economic research, but sadly, ethical discussions conducted in this literature are typically poor and quite uninformed by theological expertise. At the same time, theologians, if they write on economic issues at all, seem to be largely uninterested in the functioning of the economy. Instead, they tend to focus on broad objectives such as social justice and to point out all kinds of social and environmental evils and injustices of the capitalist economy. Pope Francis famously said that the capitalist economy kills. Now, based on economic data, one might well argue the opposite. Capitalist economies have pulled millions of people in China and other Asian countries out of abject poverty, and given the positive link between levels of income, longevity, health, and education, granted them better and longer lives. Yale theologian Catherine Tenner, whose Gifford lectures are a broad attack against current capitalism, and yet mostly manifest a complete lack of understanding of economics, does not refer to a single respected economist as a source of her work. But little is gained by such broadside attacks in terms of public attention and impact on economic policies. Theologically motivated economic visions such as Catherine Tenner's Economy of Grace surely seem very beautiful. But the critical question remains, will the resulting economy feed 8 billion people on the planet? Short of a convincing answer, who would want to pay attention? Now, my point here is obviously not that capitalism does not produce severe economic and social evils and injustices. It does, and so have other economic systems. What else should one expect from an economic system in a fallen world? Nor does capitalism produce economic evils only. Engaging in a fruitful debate about economic systems and policies from a theological perspective requires some willingness to recognize how this and alternative economic systems work and perform. What are the strengths and what are the weaknesses? Otherwise, people will not find what theologians say plausible and refuse to listen. A related point is that theologians often speak about capitalism as if there was just one kind of capitalism all over the world. But capitalism exists in many different kinds, and in different places has different forms. There is, at least in Europe and North America, no such thing as laissez-faire capitalism today, free markets and unbridled competition. Everywhere, capitalism is embedded in government regulations and networks of social assistance. Capitalism is defined by private property of the means of production, but the extent and protection of property rights differs widely across countries. Private ownership of the means of production guarantees and protects individual freedom against the powers of government bureaucracies invading the lives of all citizens. But as Marx warned, and today's tech giants like Microsoft, Alphabet, and Meta show, some industries have inherent tendencies for concentration of ownership and therefore accumulation of power, and antitrust regulation is required to sustain competition. Capitalism is defined by private risk-taking, and the expectation of private rewards for private risk has in the past been a major driving force for the improvement improvement and innovation in all areas of society, including health and education. But too often, government policies protect capital owners against losses at the cost of society, turning risky investments into one-sided bets and distorting economic decisions. Free enterprise benefits society when it operates under competition, but Adam Smith already warned us that capitalists will seek ways to limit competition, and governments often grant them protection. As a system based on voluntary transactions among private agents, capitalism deals notoriously badly with public goods such as the environment and climate. But the innovative power of capitalism has been much more effective in the environmental protection than that of other economic systems. Witness the environmental destruction that we had in socialist economies. Only the level of incomes achieved in capitalist societies have spurred public willingness to invest in environmental protection. These are just a few examples for the fact that in all dimensions of capitalism, there are large potential benefits and large potential damages to society, depending on the specific design of the legal and regulatory framework. In the past, Christian theologians worked together with economists to develop specific Christian approaches to the design of such frameworks. Such cooperation could do much to improve the performance of capitalism today. Now, coming back to Max Weber for a minute, he actually did not write about capitalism, but the spirit of capitalism. Very early in the book, he sets out to describe this spirit with a letter Benjamin Franklin once wrote to what Franklin calls a young tradesman. This letter characterizes a person who judges everything by its usefulness and whose one and only goal in life is to make money. But this was only Weber's first cut at the issue, based on a detailed study of the concept of professional calling, which he ascribed to Martin Luther, and the economic ethics of Puritan writers such as Richard Baxter. Weber concluded that the spirit of capitalism is a combination of economic asceticism, a relentless drive for profit, and hard and uninterrupted work for the sake of work alone. The ever deeper division of labor, which characterizes modern societies, promotes the development of highly specialized working people who have lost touch with culture and arts and who suffer from spiritual poverty. The spirit of capitalism turns out to be the lifestyle or the culture of a man who is incessantly busy without knowing why, who puts all his time and strength into professional activities without ever enjoying the fruits of his work, and who has no intention to pursue higher goals in life. Even the accumulation of capital is not a goal, but simply a byproduct of this lifestyle. Now, of course, the question is, can Puritan economic ethics, or can a spirit of capitalism thus described, explain the emergence of capitalism? Other authors have long pointed out that theologians and churches in other parts of the European continent, where capitalism did not develop as forcefully as in England and North America, they taught economic ethics very strongly resembling those of the Puritans. Since a lack of demand for consumer goods would inhibit the growth of markets and the economy, it is doubtful that a capitalist economy could arise among a people who are economic ascetics. A point forcefully made already in the 18th century by Bernard Mondeville in his 1714 fable of the beehive. For ascetics to sustain capitalistic development, they would need a sufficient number of gluttons at their side who would take care of the necessary consumption. Adam Smith already stressed the importance of what Veblen later called conspicuous consumption, the buying of things with the principal purpose of signaling economic status. More recent authors describe the spirit of capitalism as a mix of hedonism and consumerism, mindless consumption for the sake of consumption being the essence of life under capitalism. But that cannot be all, because the capitalist production still requires disciplined, hard-working employees. In view of this, Daniel Bell famously summarized the spirit of capitalism as a culture where people are fanatical workers and fanatical consumers, or as he puts it, straight by day and swingers by night. Catherine Tenner argues that what Weber described was the spirit of industrial capitalism, which by now has been replaced by what she calls finance-dominated capitalism. According to this view, this new spirit of capitalism adds an extreme isolation of the individual from all others. Each individual bears the cost of his own economic failures and rewards for economic successes alone. Each individual finds herself in fierce competition against all others, and this extreme form of individualism pervades all spheres of life. Now, that modern societies have lost the Christian foundations of economic and social life they once had is a commonplace. The question is to what extent these developments can be attributed specifically to the capitalist economic order. Charles Taylor, in his account of secularization, does not even mention capitalism at all. Carl Trueman's account of the triumph of the modern self draws a line from the Enlightenment to Rousseau and then on to Freud and his heirs to explain today's excessive individualism. Again, capitalism seems to have played no particular role in this. So perhaps the development of the capitalist economy and the growth in material well-being has brought conditions that have facilitated these developments, but not caused them. Now, if that is true, then I think there is hope for capitalism. The spiritual void of modern society can be filled, and the wounds of excessive individualism can be healed by Christian efforts, theology, and the church working together. Embedded in a new re-Christianized culture, capitalism will be more humane and more compatible with the preservation of God's creation than it is today. More importantly, perhaps, many evils of capitalism can be cured by the joint efforts of theologians and economists together to improve existing legal frameworks, regulations, and systems of social assistance. Economists can bring the technical expertise to this task. Many of them today are interested in ethics, but clueless about them. We need theologians, on the other hand, willing to engage in such work and bring their expertise to the task. If capitalism is to survive current popular calls for more and more powerful government to solve the economic, social, and ecological challenges of our day, such joint effort is necessary, or as Lindsay said, understand and cure. And therein, in my view, lies the promise of the dialogue between Christian theology and economics for capitalism. Thank you for your attention.